Our guest is Stacey Vetzal, who's going to be talking about what tests look like before there's code. So I'm really excited about this one. For those that don't know Stacey, she has worn many hats in her many years in the computer industry. After establishing and running her own successful software development consultancy for 15 years, well done, she's branched out to coach other organizations in adopting Agile. Stacey is now leading the internal Agile community at RBC Digital. I'm sure many of you know Stacey, and I'd be really interested to hear more about the RBC Digital, but another night. Stacey, welcome, and it's all yours now.
Thank you. All right, what do tests look like before there's code? So here's the code. So how do we test it? Well, what tends to exist before there's code? Stories. Oh, wait. Before I get into this, fair warning, I'm old and crusty. I have a lot of empathy for the folks I work with because I know the struggle, but sometimes I just got to let some of this stuff out. I've been avoiding the word Agile for a while, and lately I'm avoiding the word story. All right? So I'm sure folks have seen stories that look like this. Don't get me wrong, I love these stories. These stories are the reason I have a career, right? And I have a lot of fun with it. But, just to get us on the same page, stories aren't really intended to be a unit of work. You have to do work to realize the story, but that's not really what it's meant to be. They tell a story. About how the customer reaches a goal, how the customer does a thing. So, yeah. And, you knew this was going to have to do with test-driven something, right, when you came. Code's right in the name of the talk. And there's a lot of stuff, and when we talk about test-driven, you think about, well, what are we driving? Something is driven. You're writing a test, and you're looking to use it to drive some change, right? But what do we test? Well, we test behavior. And now, there's another aspect of this. When we're working behavior driven, we're describing the behavior we want, and that pushes you to change the system to work that way. And sometimes we think about hypothesis. I think I want the product to do this in the market, and I don't know for sure, right? But I'm going to write a hypothesis around that. And you can even do that around code. I think this is the architecture I want, but I'm not sure. So let's try something. And what do you do with a hypothesis? Well, you test it, darn it. So really what we're here thinking about is that testing is about learning, right? It's about learning about the thing you want to build, the change you might want to make to it, the effect you want to have in the market. And, just to pull forward a thing from way back, Michael Bolton and James Bach did this thing, and it had a huge impact on me, thinking about, the thing we often think about as automated tests. That's not really testing, it's more like checking. Testing is a very human-driven, a creative endeavor. And when we code out a test, that's really about reassurance. It tells us the thing that we already knew, whether it works. Whereas testing is about discovering the things that we want to know. How do we know what works? So what do we got attached to a story? We clearly got some acceptance criteria. We think about what is the condition of success. When we do this change, or when we are finished this story, working on this stuff, we know some things we need to be true, right? But you don't necessarily know everything. If you think about the notion that automated tests can really only ever tell you when there's a bug. They can never tell you if something works. Even exploratory testing, got to get really creative to actually find challenges. So quite often acceptance criteria, I love this notion from Michael Bolton, he thinks of it as rejection criteria. It's the stuff we know now, where if it doesn't do that, we can't ship it, right? So the stuff we know now that we know we can't ship. So thinking about that elevator, right? It's like, it's got to carry 15 people or we can't put it in this building. Folks get non-functional requirements in their stories sometimes. Well, that's interesting. You've got like stakeholders in the organization. They've got like security concerns, compliance concerns, maybe performance concerns. Oh, maybe that's someone else's rejection criteria. But there's an opportunity here, right? Because if you're building a cross-functional team, you can, pro tip, go and bring some of that learning inside, figure out what that is, why it is, make it your own rejection criteria, and bring it inside. So sometimes it's tough to write tests, right? Coming up with all the different scenarios. There are little systems we can use to try and figure it out. But when we think about testing, right, this is what we think of as the special thing about a tester. But, when we're doing TDD and stuff like that, well, we're all testing. And so sometimes to get us into the swing of it, these little monikers can help. And this is thanks James Grenning for this one. But you can see it all represented here, the 0 condition doesn't order coffee. The 1 condition orders a coffee, Lots of stuff to explore. And, when they say, oh, developers can't test their own code. Well, I think that's a little bit silly. I think we can absolutely reason about different things. It's not like we're necessarily stuck in one lane, but, sometimes a little bump can help. And if we're TDDing something through, that's a little easier to do. So remember, testing's about learning. As a developer who writes tests, for example, think about the act of writing the test. That's exploring, right? Learning about what the next change should be. You ever do spike stories? Spike stories are all about learning. Do you write test first on your spike stories? Is that an opportunity? Okay, so let's start learning. I like to think that learning starts from a position of humility. Certainly if you think about like hypothesis-driven product changes, I think I know the thing that I want. I'm not 100% certain, right? But to learn, you've got to kind of empty the cup, You've got to concede that you may not know for certain, and you become ready to learn. So when we're coming up with this criteria, right, quite often we express this criteria as rules, and I like to distinguish rules and examples. That's a rule. Elevator must carry 15 people. Careful of rules. Rules are ambiguous. Ambiguity breeds bugs, right? So we've got better ways to elaborate on this. For example, why is this so specific? 2,500 pounds or 15 persons. Is that the same thing? I don't know. It's neat though here. We got 2 different domains we're talking about, aren't we? There's like 15 people. If I'm the user of an elevator, I think about how many people are on it. If I'm the engineer designing the elevator, I probably think more about weight, right? And there's a little neat thing in here. I love to talk about precision versus accuracy. 1,134 kilograms. Well, that's awfully specific, isn't it? Well, it's just 2,500 pounds. So 1,134 feels precise, but 2,500 pounds, that doesn't feel that precise. So careful of that, right? When you do something, say you're estimating story points and you get all this precision in it, but, you know, is that really accurate? They're two different things. So I love to explore using examples. So, you know, this is the Friends episode naming convention is one of my favorites. This is the one where Joey speaks French. Well, actually, this is the one where we load 2,500 pounds worth of people into the elevator and everything's fine. The elevator continues to work. Right? So this is a test scenario. This is a test. We've expressed it with Gherkin here, that whole given when then thing. But this is squarely sitting in the engineering domain. You know, if you think about domain languages or ubiquitous language in how you describe a system, maybe it's best to write your tests so that you involve different people, right? Understandable to the end user, understandable to the engineer that needs to actually build this elevator. And the given when then thing, you know, while we could use a technology like Cucumber to execute these tests, which is fun to do, it's really awesome. Doesn't have to be. You know, sometimes I like Cucumber when other people are going to be reading the tests. But if I'm in an environment where only like the development folks are reading the tests, or the tests are maybe understandable enough, I'm not sure this is. But any test framework, of course, can run any kinds of tests, including acceptance tests like these. So let's dig in for just a couple of minutes. Well, I'm gonna dig in over here. So, you know, we started writing this thing where customer wants an elevator, and I don't even know. You know, I just started writing this test. Is this even what we want to call it? Is it an elevator? Is it a conveyance? I'm not sure, but I'm going to make a decision here, right? I'm going to say, well, I'm going to call it an elevator for now, and then, you know, we'll see how it goes. Maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't. But that was just my first call my shot, make the shot, see how I feel about it, call the next shot. And when I'm driving a system out with tests, I'll just continue to do that over and over again. Whoops, I can't spell. If I was smart, I'd have done this better.
So smart or not, you're clearly brave doing live coding like this.
I always live code. I have to live code in every talk.
Right on.
So at some point, right, your tests start to get filled in. When you start thinking about more complete scenarios, look at all the stuff I've imagined here. Very little of it actually exists yet, but I'm now already kind of having a bit of a conversation in this domain language. I'm talking about an elevator. I'm talking about like onboarding. I don't know if that's the right word, onboarding some weight. Asking the elevator if it's in service. Is it the elevator that should tell me that? Or is there some sensor in the, I don't know. But I'm basically designing how I interact with this thing, right? So this is effectively top-down test-driven development. The system doesn't exist yet, but I'm using tests, and specifically acceptance tests, to start exploring its interface to the world, or its interface to other developers. The models that we set up in our code, we're going to have to live with for a while. I'd hate to make a bad decision early on when I don't know much. I want to learn and learn and learn, and then start making decisions that are harder to go back on. Right now, it's super easy. At some point, you know, I'm going to have done some things. Oops, yeah, that's not supposed to be there. You know, I'm going to have I'm still talking about the elevator. You can see like the word survived this long. Maybe it'll survive long enough. I've got the one where we load 2,500 pounds on it, the one where I load 2,501 pounds on it. And we can have all these boundary decisions, right? That's the B in zombies. What are your boundary conditions? Well, explore them out. They're probably in the acceptance criteria, or you hope they're in the acceptance criteria, or if they're not, you put them there after you write these tests, or you have that conversation with folks and say, is this important? I discovered this. I learned this thing while I was testing. I know the system doesn't exist yet, but I'm still testing. All right. Let's jump back. I will offer one word of caution. Test the product. Don't test the changes. Don't test the story, right? I ran into this once and it was quite a lesson. Say this is your product. I don't like the fox. Make it a sparrow. Test passes. I don't like the dog. Make it a rabbit. Okay, tests are passing. Here's my test suite, right? Everything's great. It's fantastic. Until I look at the product. What's wrong with the product? Sparrows don't jump. Right? So remember, test the product, not the stories. There's a whole lot. What am I trying to say here? Well, first off is testing starts way earlier than folks think. Like right at the beginning, right at the, am I sure that customers are actually going to want this change I want to make to the system? I don't know. Let's make that a hypothesis and test it out. If you fall into this and you're building nice acceptance checks as automated tests, look at that language. Man, words are hard. But your regression tests, this is going to build up. They become your reassurance. And don't keep them all. Don't do that. Keep the good ones, the important ones, the ones that everybody agrees are important. Didn't write acceptance tests yesterday? Ooh, huh? How are you catching those regressions? And then all the kinds of tests first, right? Whether it's test-driven development, behavior-driven development, acceptance test-driven development. Don't really care what you call it, but they're the same kind of thing. Call your shot. This is the thing that I think I want to accomplish, and then take your shot. Prove it out. When you write your tests first, you're destined to create better tests, right? Because as a friend of mine explained this to me on my last gig, you can't accidentally test the implementation instead of the product if when you write the tests, there's no implementation yet. That is the number one reason why people hate their test suites, right? They're hard. The tests fail all the time. Every time I change the code. Well, I bet you're testing the implementation and not the product. So you get better code because your code will be testable, but testable code is more flexible and you're going to have better products. And voila.
Stacey, that was a whirlwind, and I think a first that we've actually seen someone do live coding at an AgileTO QuickTalks. So thank you for that. A few of you actually have already caught on to the fact that that at AgileTO we do now open it up for questions and answers. If you do have a question, let me know. A few of you have sent me questions privately in the chat, so maybe I'll just start with those while the rest of you are coming up with your questions. But one of the things you talked about, Stacey, that a couple of people have asked about is you mentioned the idea of automated testing and exploratory testing. Are there other types of testing that are worth calling out?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. Well, it all depends on your perspective, Are folks familiar with that testing quadrants diagram?
Let's assume we aren't.
Yeah, it was one of my first fun tools where it would sort of break things up, and these are the kinds of tests that support the developers. They check the technology. These other things, these are the kinds of tests that support the business. They critique the product. These are the kind. So it sort of breaks it up into that. And if you think of like unit tests, like you're doing test-driven development at the unit level, well, those support me, the developer, right? They're there to make sure I write the right thing. And the flip side, the BDD or the ATDD, those acceptance tests, they support the business, the product. They make sure the product remains whole throughout the whole thing. But there's a lot of stuff in between, That quadrants diagram was recently, well, maybe not so recently, but updated at some point, because tests that critique the product, there were a lot of them that were indicated as like manual tests. Well, yeah, you're going to do like exploratory testing. I'm going to come up with a charter and then sit down with that charter and then knock around the product, according to the charter. I want to beat it up for like, I don't know, browser compatibility, or I'm going to try a whole bunch of SQL injection attacks, or like whatever your thing is. They don't have to be. When you get into techniques like fuzz testing or property-based testing, that's a fun one. This is effectively an exploratory discovery technique that developers would employ. So it's not necessarily manual to do exploratory testing. So there's a whole world of different kind of testing, like contract testing. Anybody use PACT or tools like that? Those are kind of nifty.
I think we might have to, at the end of this, Stacey, put up maybe some links as to some of these resources, or maybe where we can go and read more about that. But I don't want to dig in. We can spend, it sounds like we could spend the next 20 minutes just talking about different types of testing. No, it's great. It's so good. The answer to the question, though, is yes, there's lots of different types of testing. And so we can dig into that. A couple of other people had questions in here. If you could maybe talk a little bit more and maybe dig in to the delineation or the distinction you make between testing and checking. A few people have made comments that was a really interesting distinction that you made.
Yeah, I totally wholeheartedly stole that from Michael Bolton and James Bach. When you're building tests, like when you're testing, think of exploratory testing. That's like a pure kind of testing. It's human against the product. How can I break this thing? What can I do with it? It's very creative, very creative. And once I discover a thing, it's like, oh, look, I can break it by doing this. Then I write an automated test. Now, the automated test only knows how to do the thing that I did that one time, right? So it's just checking what I already knew, right?
That's a great way. That's a great way to describe it. That's really cool. Maybe just sort of building on that, you talked a little bit more about not testing the implementation, testing the product. I think there were a few people, based on the fact that a couple of messages came in, that a few people didn't quite get that. Isn't testing the product the same as testing the implementation? Like, can you maybe build on that one a little bit?
Oh my goodness, many places I could take that. So, okay, I'll start with one idea. First of all, your code base is only the current realization of your product, right? It's not your product per se. Your product is the idea that you created in the marketplace. You could rebuild it with a completely different code base, throw the first one away, and it's the same product, right? So that's at one level. And you can think about things like what's the half-life of the code in your code base? How, does your code get in there and then just kind of rot over time, never get updated? Or, maybe the half-life of your code is like a month. So every month you have rewritten the code that is the foundation for half your product, right? And this is healthy. This is how you keep on top of technological change, which is relentless, right? It is an external influence and you just got to deal with it. But there's other aspects of this. So like if I was writing, like think of that elevator, right? Notice way at the top, I asked the elevator if it was in service or not. And that might have been quite a complicated question. The elevator might have had to go and check with all kinds of other things, right? And some series of conditions might cause it to report back to me that, yeah, everything's great. Well, if I write tests around all those little things inside, right? And then I decide, I don't like that sensor. There's this new sensor that we want to use for the elevator that works a totally different way. I want to use that new sensor. If my tests are based on the implementation on that old sensor, all of a sudden my tests are going to start failing. I'm going to have to rework them. Whereas if I talk through that public interface, the notion of the elevator, if that's the right abstraction that I want to build my test suites around, then I don't care what the implementation is. I just have to know that if I put more than 15 people in the elevator, it's not going to work, right? So the tests will continue to pass if I change the sensor or things like that. So it's all about picking that right level of abstraction.
How do you know what that right level of abstraction is?
I never do. You know how I find out? Scientific method. Try a thing, see if it works.
Iterate.
Do it again.
Experiment.
Yeah, it sounded like, and it looked like even when in your elevator experiment there, that you were really using your tests as an opportunity to learn about the abstraction and about the words. Is the elevator the right word, or should it be called the descender, or the lifter of people, or the dumbwaiter? So it seemed to me, and I maybe I'm naive in this space, but it seems to me you're using your tests before you're writing any code to really help you think through the problem.
100%. That's exactly it. And not only think through, engage others. Talk to the product folks, talk to the compliance folks, talk to this different stakeholders, and find that what you'd call in domain-driven development, find that ubiquitous language, the word that everybody uses, and put that word in the code so that when somebody's looking at that code, they're not confused in the future. I don't know how much code I've seen where it's like the business calls it this and the code calls it that. Is it the same thing? I don't know. So now I'm a noob developer in there and I got no idea what's going on because the code doesn't talk to me like the business talks to me.
So one of the things you just mentioned in that answer was domain. What did you say?
Domain-driven development.
Domain-driven development. Now, I've seen a bunch of things that have
design
showing up in there. I've seen TDD, ATDD, BDD, and now DDD.
Yeah.
Are you just messing with me, or are these all different things?
100%. Totally messing with you.
Totally messing.
But this is how we figure out what we want the engineering of software to look like, right? These ideas, they come forward. They come forward from people that are doing the work. And like that's the spirit of Agile, right? We do the work and we learn by doing the work and then we do better work, right? So these ideas, they propagate and they're great to understand. So I steal like ubiquitous language from domain-driven design all the time. I don't steal a lot from it, but there's always something to learn from all these things. I'm happy to provide some of the links that I share with folks to sort of introduce them to the ideas.
Okay, I got 3 questions left, but we are hitting our 30-minute mark in our quick talk. So in a second, a link is going to pop up in the chat window. If anyone does have to drop off, please take a moment to fill out that link. But there are 3 questions left, Stacey, if we're good on these. And the first question that I've got for you that's come up here is, you're using tests to explore a space to try and define the problem. Eric said it beautifully, explicitly define the problem in his opinion, which seems to be pretty consistent. How do you do that in environments that use words like, I'm sorry, we're a highly regulated environment. We have to define all of the requirements up front. The developers just need to code what we tell them to. How do you respond in those sorts of environments? Besides, no.
Maybe you should waterfall. No, I mean, there are situations where something like waterfall development is maybe more effective if things are not changing so much. I don't know what kind of markets that would be these days.
Yeah.
But, the whole point of this agile stuff, right, is so that we can respond to change in a reasonable way, that we don't feel hamstrung by our past, our legacy, right? We want to have the confidence that we can change the code as it needs to adapt. We don't go asking for a bucket of money to rebuild the system, software development bankruptcy.
So kind of tied into that one is a similar, it's in the similar vein, and that's, what do you tell to people who have their job identities as testers and they're used to being after the development is done? What's your advice to them, or to any of us, because it seems you're taking a very different approach in the testing in terms of using it really as that learning tool.
So I'm gonna say a thing, and it's quite controversial. Writing code might be the least useful thing your developers can do for you. Think about that a minute. Every line of code is a liability. It's a bug waiting to happen, right? So think about the skills that a tester has built up over a career of testing. Oh my gosh. Like that TDD driven by zombies. Like, as a developer, I needed that like aid to help me through it. These folks, they know it intuitively. It's just how they think about things. That's a skill that you need on your team, right? So find the ways to work together and find the ways to honor each other's skills and abilities that they bring to the table.
Oh my goodness, Stacey, I love that answer. That's amazing, and it gives me hope in so many people that I get to talk to. All right, last question, and this is the easy one. This has been amazing, but I really feel like you've like barely scratched the surface on this. If folks are interested in more, you mentioned a few names, you mentioned a few folks. Where do I go to learn more about this topic that we just did a really quick talk on?
Oh boy. Well, okay, so you can hit me up on Twitter. There are some really good communities. I love like Ministry of Testing. If you're not aware of that, that's a great place. They run the Test Bash events. They're doing Test Bash Home tomorrow and Friday. That's a free event that folks can go to. And it's just, I think, oh shoot, I'm not going to say the URL because I'll get it wrong, but it's ministryoftesting.something. Some of my...
Robert says that it's ministryoftesting.com.
Thank you, Robert. And the thing that launched me into this is Gojko Adzik. So I will spell his name, Gojko Adzik, Adzic. Look him up. It started in my career reading Bridging the Communication Gap. That book changed my world, right? And the stuff I took today, I mean, this is effectively a specification by example, another book of his, right? He's got some fantastic material out there. So check him out.
Stacey, this was fantastic. And the only problem with QuickTalks is that they just get the appetite going. There is so much more depth on this topic, and we know that, but we also know that there is Zoom fatigue is a real thing, which is one of the reasons AgileTO continues with this quick talk. But this alone was a fantastic touch on the topic, and between zombies and DDDs and TDDs, you've opened up hopefully some of our eyes, at least mine, and that's ultimately what matters to me. So a great talk. Thank you so much on behalf of AgileTO, and really appreciate you spending the time with us tonight. And I might hit you up on Twitter. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining tonight. Just a reminder, there is a link in the chat window for feedback. If you would be so kind as to take probably less than 90 seconds to complete that feedback survey. Really helps the organizers know what topics are of interest as we continue on with this. Stacey, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you for the questions in the chat. They were great. I think I got to all of them, but thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening.